everyone, and welcome to All Things Grace podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Majors, and today we have a very, very special guest joining us. We're going to be talking to Sergeant Arman. Is it Arman or Arman?
Arman is fine.
Arman, okay. Sergeant Arman Barros, law enforcement leader from a Seattle area agency here. Sergeant Barros has an incredible story just to share about his, journey into law enforcement, like motivations and challenges that have shaped his career, and your perspective on the critical role of law enforcement in fostering unity and understanding in our society, in our communities. That is why I asked you to be here. I really want to dig into that. We'll also be talking about, some of the tougher issues, some of those deep divisions in our community, and how we can collectively come together to build bridges between law enforcement and the public. So we're going to be digging in a lot here today on lots of different things. So everybody just sit back and relax and join us for this insightful, I feel like a pilot, just sit back and relax and enjoy the 45-minute ride that we are about to embark upon together, trying to bridge this divide and finding grace in the midst of the conflict and division. So thank you so much. Welcome, Sergeant Barros, and thanks for being here.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. I mean, I know that in the age of media, when you have so much media is coming at people from a variety of directions, and for you to give me an opportunity to step on your platform, I hope to do it great justice, and just give the opportunity to give some of your listeners some great feedback and insight, and maybe give them some perspectives they hadn't thought about before, because these are challenging times.
Yes.
That every generation, I'm an 80s baby. I was born in the 80s. And so I grew up. And so there were challenges then, there'll be challenges now, there's challenges tomorrow. So we've got to get really built and dialed into getting that opportunity to really kind of unpack a lot of it. So I'm happy to join you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sergeant Barros. So first, I just want to learn a little bit about what inspired you, right, to pursue a career in law enforcement. And how is I'll try not to do these 2 and 3 part questions. I'll try to throw it in. But the question is, let me just say what the question is what inspired you to pursue a career in law enforcement? And how has it changed over the years since you have, been in law enforcement?
Yeah. So actually, it's a story. I guess it's got a certain uncommon parts to it, but a lot of it is the same reasons that a lot of people join law enforcement. Is to make a difference in either their respective community. As my father taught me, I didn't pick up everything my father was trying to teach me. God bless him. But I picked up a couple of good things. And one of the things was you have to decide if you're going to be part of the solution and the problem. There's no middle ground. If you're silent on some things, then you ultimately are giving your silent support for whatever's going on. So you have to be able to speak up, speak out, or act in a way that is solution oriented. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and the way I like to describe it is it's like this kind of, and many people that grew up in this, in there, it's surrounded by this deep South and this hard history of America, as I like to describe it. And so I grew up, obviously, in a sense of, okay, the police are here to help us, but be somewhat cautious. Now, my father worked in a hospital environment. So did my mother. My mother was a pharmacist. My dad worked in anesthesiology. And so we grew up, and then my father's mother was a staunch supporter of education. Education was her thing. So coming from the baby boomer generation, having grown up through the civil rights movement, obviously in Atlanta, you can't grow up in Atlanta and not know about the civil rights movement unless you just decide to keep your head in the sand. So there was I grew up with a sense of obligation about education, about giving education and fostering that. And they instilled in me, a lot of people say, you don't sound like you're from the South. Well, that's because my dad didn't know how. He was from Cleveland, so he didn't really allow a lot of that, stuff, and how he enunciate. And that has taken me far, as being able to really enunciate, or try at the very least to be articulate, right? So that people will obviously, engage and be willing to listen to what you have to say. I was not always the best student. I was a hard-headed kid. I learned the hard way. I was like, okay, on to the next grade. Didn't really pay much attention to it. Getting into adult life, I certainly look back, wish I'd have paid a lot more attention in those, high school years. But But when I grew up, I always had a pull. I think anyone that gets into law enforcement, there is a calling. It may be much more, it may be louder for others than it is for some people, but it's a calling. And if you don't feel deep in your heart that something is pulling you to serve your community, then you may want to try to look for another way to help or support.
Mm-hmm.
I always had that calling, but and not to be negative about my community in Atlanta, it just wasn't at the top of a list of career fields. It was go be a doctor, go be a lawyer, go do this, go do that, but don't be a police officer.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of went into college and even grad school thinking, okay, I'll do something other than law enforcement. Then I got to, I guess, early 30s, and I said to myself, I don't want to be 50 and say that I had never done anything for this country. You're clearly here. I'm sure your audience is clear. I'm clear on the fact of how much blood African Americans have spilled for this country, both on battlefields across with various battlefields and wars we've had, but also through the dark history of slavery. And that makes me feel an even greater sense of pride that this is my country. And patriotism, I think, sometimes is lost in our community as well, because it's how do we grapple with this pain? How do we deal with a country or fight and choose to protect a country that in some ways feels like they're here to hate, fear, and vilify us, right? Just for being. So it's hard sometimes. But when you really take the opportunity to step out and break through, you'll find the good in this country, and you'll find that that good is worth protecting and keeping safe. So in my career shift, I decided to join the Army. I, branched chemical at first. So I was a nerd in a uniform, basically. Branched chemical, and then the service bug just kept going from there. So I joined the U.S. Army, then went into the Army Reserve. And in the reserve capacity, it's not obviously a full-time job. So I said, in training with some friends of mine and working out, they said, you really should try law enforcement. And the rest kind of speaks for itself. I started at a different agency and then lateral to my current agency, where I'm currently a sergeant. I've been blessed to move up that ladder and gain great experience. And I think when you look at my career, some people will say, well, I haven't been in law enforcement that long, and that's true. But I think my prior history before military service and then military service and now in the law enforcement service, leadership is something that I just tend to have, I feel gravitate towards, because I feel like it has to start at the top. It has to be something where people can look out and say, that's the right direction. That should be our heading. And let's try and trend that path. So I'm hoping I captured all the essence of your question and how I got here today. So
yeah. And have you seen, so first, how long, because you said your career hasn't been that long in law enforcement. So how long has it been? And have you seen any major changes, or has it evolved in the time that you've been in?
Yeah. And I think the changes that I've seen have been those, it was kind of like getting hit with two hurricanes. So I started law enforcement in 2015. And when you get into law enforcement and you see police culture, not that I've physically policed in New York City, but New York City policing is different than Seattle policing, is different than Georgia policing, is different than Oklahoma policing, because the communities are different, right? Every community, from the small towns to the county areas to the statewide agencies, they all have to understand what their role needs to be in that community. So when I started policing in 2015, until now where I'm at currently, George Floyd happened and COVID happened. Two issues that push the limits of our sensibilities in this country in different ways, from vaccine mandates to mask mandates, travel restrictions, to obviously the murder of George Floyd, and how we grapple with that. And I tell people all the time when they ask me kind of how I've seen it shift, people don't see the department you work for on your uniform. They see a badge and the word police. And most people engage that way. So if they have a negative experience, I try to take that with me into any call for service or interaction that I try to have with the public. Is this person may have had terrible experiences with the police, good, bad, whether the police were right or wrong. They may have had an experience. I can control this experience, though. And I can control whether or not they walk off. It's not all that different than my educational pursuits. And my pursuits for doing the things that I've chosen to do with my career has been, I wanted to get education, stay the course, not commit crimes, all that kind of stuff, because I had a sense that people have this impression that Black men are dangerous, that Black men are violent, that Black men are all criminals. And if even I could be the one example, then it takes the whole argument away. So I carry that weight with me into law enforcement. And then being in law enforcement, it's carrying that weight as well to say, not all these police are trying to do these horrific things and criminal violations. And those are the hot stories, right? The officer doing the wrong thing.
Mhm.
But for every one of those stories, there's countless stories of officers going above and beyond their call of duty to be a guardian of democracy and to be someone that leads and protects and serves their community well. So that's
Mm.
what we grapple with, or at least that's what I personally grapple with. I know there's other officers that probably experience the same thing.
Yeah. So was there anything that like surprised you? You know how you start a job or you have a mind, an idea of what something is, and then you get into it, and you're like, hey, this isn't what I
Yeah,
thought it
right.
was. Or
Yeah.
was there anything that surprised you pleasantly or maybe not so pleasant?
Well, so I started in law enforcement. I think I mean, one example of many probably is report writing. When I was like, oh, I have a master's degree, I can write a police report. And some of my early FTOs were like, dude, like, what did you just send in? So I had to struggle there. So that was eye opening too, because
Mm,
it's a different type of writing, it's a different type of professional work that you're doing.
mm,
So even though you may have a high degree of formal education, there still is that piece. So that was part of it. Um, I've trained martial arts since, well, I started wrestling in 1996, did martial arts since 2004. So I've been training the art a while. And initially that was part of the reason why I got into law enforcement. It was because prior to joining, I said, well, it would be really good. Even prior to joining, I realized a lot of use of force and excessive force situations were based on training. In other words, the officers just didn't have the skill set to handle the situation, right? And so getting into law enforcement, it was shocking to me how little defensive tactics training that most officers receive. I mean,
mm,
it's almost like sending someone onto a battlefield without a rifle, right? I
mm.
mean, you have got to send people armed to do the job that you're asking them to do. And unfortunately, most agencies, and that was eye opening too. It's like, oh, we should just spend hours training, right? Well, there's so much to train. You could
Mm.
have a 40-year-long law enforcement career and still learn something new on your last day of your job. I
Yeah.
mean, there's just too much between the investigative knowledge, criminal procedure, criminal law, constitutional law, use of force, department policy, credential, you know, whether or not your accreditation, all those things are things that we as a department have to have. For every officer you see, there's probably at least two or three other admin staff in that respective department that's helping to keep all of that stuff and enable them to do their job. So that
Mhm.
was eye opening to me just to understand how massive it was. And I knew, again, kind of going back to the difference between being a part of the problem or part of the solution, even when I was frustrated before joining law enforcement with things, for example, like Rodney King, right? Or you're seeing the Trayvon Martin case, even though that really didn't involve a law enforcement officer. When you're seeing these things, you go into it having a sense of, oh, I can go in here and I can do this, and this should be an easy job. And then
Mm.
you realize this is an extremely challenging job.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that, again, going back, we touched on a little bit a minute ago about leadership, but fostering a culture of wellness and support for officers. If they're led right and taken care of, then they'll do their job admirably. And I like to tell people that if we can take care of police officers, the police officers will take care of the public and take
Mm.
care of them in a good way where they won't feel that their backs against the wall and we're seeing a collision of things. Um,
Mhm.
in my opinion, Derek Chauvin didn't happen overnight. That
Mhm.
was several stressful incidents that happened in that person's life where he wasn't brought in and led and developed and you know broken down and things like that to help prevent his mind from going where it needed to go to, or for excuse me, where it went to on the time on that day when he encountered George Floyd. And so that those were the shocking things for me when I started law enforcement, was just how challenged, but it's actually motivated me to develop more, going to graduate school and understanding criminal justice, because which is another part that's shocking to me too, is how easy it is, how we can lose track of the importance of data and real hard science in law enforcement and letting that help guide our policy. I've spoken to professors from University of Washington, some professors from the University of Colorado, trying to just pick apart this science. And what they've seen is that there's a big divide in our criminal justice policies and criminal justice research. When I was in school, I did a graduate program in criminal justice, and that was one of the big takeaways I got from that education was that we have this data and research that tells us stuff, but when you look at the criminal procedures and law that's enacted and built, it's rarely really based on that hard science. And that is the battle that every law enforcement officer faces on a daily basis too. You have your logical brain and your emotional brain, and they're colliding constantly. Mm-hmm. And through hard work, training, and emotional intelligence training and leadership development, that battle is easier to keep together so that we can execute what's going on.
So, oh boy, I have 90 million. So also I'm typing, I'm not doing it. So I'm trying to all my notes in my head here.
No worries.
2 questions. You talk about Chauvin. What I interpreted you to say was that he was not provided the tools necessary to be able to show up in a different way that day. And plus there had been multiple incidences that had gone unchecked, and he didn't, there weren't opportunities for course correction. Apparently he had choked someone like this same fashion before, and there were things like that. So I'm wondering 2 questions. One is it a behavior or is it a training thing? Is there a point or an assessment where we can determine up front, no, this person really has racist tendencies, or he has a propensity to do something that if he does not do the self-reflection or the training or whatever he needs, this thing will inevitably happen? Is there any kind of process or vetting system where we can kind of foresee these things? That's the first question. And the second question is, you said if you take care of your officers will take care of the community. What kind of care are you referring to when you say take care of officers? You name some things, but if you can be more specific than that, you can answer any of those in whatever order, which one stands out for you.
Well, I'll try to answer your first question. I guess your first question. In my opinion, with law enforcement, specifically with Derek Chauvin, if we could point to that one thing that we could say that's the spot, right? That's the one solution, then you and I'd probably be billionaires right now, because every agency would say, "Oh, well, give us and come teach us this one answer." When I talk about, and if I make sure I capture what you're asking too with this first question, Derek Chauvin. When I say, and I want to make sure too, I want to take this opportunity. In no way, shape, or form is my response trying to give an excuse for his actions. That's right. Mm-hmm. He was of sound mind and body when he did what he did. We have had a trial. He is where he is right now based on his actions and behaviors. But when you start seeing a pattern of behavior as a supervisor in law enforcement, we have to recognize a pattern of behavior. But we have to peel back those layers to try to understand why the officer is behaving this way. So your first question, your second question are kind of connected in that way. Taking care of an officer, for example, I watched a video of an officer who responded to a house situation with a young girl and her mother. And the daughter had run off, but now the officer was talking with the mom, and another subject came out of the house and starts arguing with the officer. And the officer gets in a knockdown, drag out fist fight with this person. Mm-hmm. Clearly excessive force, no reason to do this. I mean, he's just bullying this new person. Well, the officer then goes to his car, and later come to find out this officer is going through a divorce. Mm-hmm. This officer is about to go bankrupt. He's working double, triple overtime, trying to take care of things. So there's these compounding stress. So we're taking a stressed person and we're putting them in more stressful situations without being able to say that. I can't force my officers not to work overtime, but I always pull certain officers aside when I see they're working 2 and 3 and 12-hour overtime shifts. You have to, and even from a human resources perspective, I have to be careful about what questions I ask because I can't get too personal. But I need to make that officer know that Sergeant Barros is looking out for me. He's trying to make sure that he's aware of everything that I might be struggling and dealing with. Anytime I see an officer working a lot of overtime, usually it's for a noble reason. You know, they want to remodel their house or they want to, you know, buy their new car or something like that. But what is that? Are they struggling financially? And then, of course, we have issues because officers are human beings. And I think people see that badge and that uniform, they think somehow that gives them superpowers. And in some ways it does. But in many other ways it doesn't. This is still a human being. So when I see those overtimes working, we need to, I think as a department or as a profession in law enforcement, just making sure that our sergeants, our supervisors, our leaders keep that line of communication open so that that officer knows, hey, if this that I know my department wants me to do well. We offer a ton of resources at my agency. Some agencies have it in different capacities, but we have an employee assistance program, and they offer everything from relationship counseling, financial counseling, stress and health management. I work for a great agency that allows you to get a period of time during your shift to go work out so you can relieve stress and taking care of yourself. And I've seen officers use that in a variety of ways. Some officers will go to the gym and do a CrossFit workout, doing pull-ups and all kinds of stuff. Other officers just lay there and meditate, just rest. Your human body is also a reflection of that. Going back to D2 training that I taught earlier. So I've trained in the art specifically of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for quite a while. And people think that the magic of that is the arm locks and the joint locks and the controls and all the different things you do. It's actually training your emotional mind. And what that means, you can stay calm when someone's trying to break your arm. More likely than not, you're going to find a solution to that problem, safely escape, and then move on to other tactics and techniques that are going to keep you and the suspect safe. You know, so that type of training is what we're seeking to build in. Kind of circling back to Derek Chauvin, and feel free to re-ask that first question if I missed any of the details that you wanted to ask. If I didn't quite get there, but going back to Derek Chauvin, his inability to even stop and really observe what he was doing. I've said this to several people. Obviously, I've had quite a few of these conversations with different people, from family members to members of the public to leaders. When that crowd started to gather around him, it wasn't this sense of fear, it was this sense of control. It was I'm not going to let these other people tell me what to do. I'm the law here. I'm in control. I'm here. And I think some officers, especially those officers that are around each other, now we have a duty to intervene in the state where I practice law enforcement, where if that situation were to happen today in my department and I didn't pull Derek Chauvin off of George Floyd, I would be subject to criminal prosecution. So it's also this, and it's part of that unfortunate piece in evolution, because we shouldn't have to make a law for that, right? Like, we would think that as human beings, we would be in a place where, no, we're going to intervene and try to do this. But again, you might happen upon and far be it from me to tell anybody to get involved in law enforcement, even me, when I'm not in uniform. Obviously, I would run to the aid of an officer if I was out of uniform because I'm skilled to do so. So I would never encourage a member of the public to see that and go physical with that officer, especially because you may not know all the circumstances that are going on there. But this was obvious, right? Like, this was a case of an individual who's handcuffed, who is, struggling for his life. Obviously there was plenty of time for them to realize this needs to stop.
Yeah.
Touching back to what you mentioned before too, I did feel a little bit of that now that I've seen a specific incident, but I can understand too why some of these officers were in this mental lock. Sometimes it's going black, where you go black over and you don't realize you're not able to respond. You just freeze. Sense of authority and control in some law enforcement agencies, in the law enforcement cultures that we make, meant that Derek Chauvin was in a supervisory position to some of those other officers. So we weren't able to break out of that freeze mode and say, it's okay for me to correct my supervisor. It's okay for me to go to the senior officer here and tell him you're doing something wrong in those moments.
Can I follow up with that? So there's that human piece, right? And I think, gosh, this is so, because our human instinct is, you would think that would override, because it was a long period of time where he's slowly taken the life out of this person. 9 minutes. And you're looking and going, and there, there's all these dynamics at play.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I know is that sometimes for people who are not in the situation is like, it's obvious. Come on, jump in, like stop him.
Mhm.
I do believe that there is a certain kind of culture that you're like, I can't override what you're saying, right? And again, then you add the layer of different regional differences and how we do the work. And then there's layers of what were the stressors, and then there are the layers, like all of these things compile into these critical moments. And so, but I always kind of go back to you brought up something that I had forgotten that I felt, and that was, don't you as a human at some point go, boss, whoever you are, you're killing this person.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about what you think, other than that's my boss and I don't want to step on, get in trouble or that? Can you tell me any other things that may have been going on that stopped them from taking action?
Intervening. That's where that I think the that deeper critical science piece is so necessary,
Mm.
because we're talking about psychology, we're talking about cognitive skills, we're talking about cultural awareness, we're talking about emotional intelligence. Any number of these things could have restricted these people from acting. Um, when you look at law enforcement and how serious and officer safety and having each other's back, for example, let's assume this call had been different. Let's assume that Derek Chauvin was stopped from kneeling on him for 9 minutes. He put him on the ground, and then they got medic there. And George Floyd, as we all wish, was alive today. Even most, just about every law enforcement officer I know, wishes that no one has to go to work dying. I can specifically remember one of my instructors in the academy that I went through came into our academy class, and he said, "Who's here to arrest people today?" And I said, "I'm not here to arrest anybody. I'll arrest you if I have to, but I come to work hoping to be of community service. Now, if I find a law that's broken, I'm going to take the action of it. But I'm not coming to work with this kind of sense of I've got to go kick in a door today and find this person and this, that, and the other."
Yeah.
Now, God bless all our SWAT team guys. God bless all our detectives, all our tip of the spear guys, as they like to call them. I'm not cool enough to be one of those guys, but those guys go into the very dangerous situations, and that's what they're built to do. But there's this sense of control that has to come over you, and that awareness. But I think it touches too on that power of leadership, right? And where you're at when you start. A lot of times, newer officers will get hired by an agency, go to the academy, then come back to their department and go through a training program. And it's in that training program that they learn more about the culture of the department, the culture of the community they're policing in, and doing it, quote unquote, the department's way. So that's why people are now looking at a deep dive at that particular, at Derek Chauvin's department, and saying, well, is this the normal culture that is encouraged for officers to do? And is it possible that they weren't going code? They're possible like, oh, this is just how we police in, Minneapolis. This is what we do. This is how we engage this community. So those are those situations. I think, though, really, if you just go on the individual level and deal with the brain of the officer involved, I I like to think that they had a sense and feeling that what they were seeing was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a phrase in law enforcement that gets used a good bit called the reasonable officer standard. In other words, what would a
Reasonable officer, say it again?
reasonable officer standard?
Okay.
Meaning, an officer with similar training to those people watching Derek Chauvin do this, what would they have done?
Mm-hmm.
And you get there by asking officers and by interviewing several officers and studying the data and getting the responses and doing training feedback and all those things to say this is a general standard. And there's no they the phrase, there's multiple ways to skin a cat.
Mm-hmm.
Forgive me if I offend any animal lovers out there, but there's multiple ways of dealing with the situation.
Uh-huh.
Um, so you're always going to have a little bit of wiggle room, discretion in how you deal with something, but that those standards that we can't deviate from, that's where we need you to operate within.
Mm-hmm.
And in that operational part is keeping someone like Derek Chauvin from committing a violent act on someone else. I think too, as well, when you discuss body cam footage, camera footage, every single device we have on us now, there's always a camera within arm's reach of us everywhere. Nowadays, even your watch has cameras on it, right? So
Mhm.
I think that we're now obviously able to see these things happening, and now we're being alerted to these problems. But we also have, again, that we're fighting that tide against these certain cultures in these departments what
Mhm.
becomes a standard. I don't think again, Derek Chill, like I said earlier, he didn't get created overnight.
Right.
There's repeated calls that he went in when he was a rookie cop, and he was like, "Oh, I want to come out here. I want to serve the community." And then somewhere along that line, he made certain choices and decisions that led him to move in this negative direction. Um, it's unfortunate because, just to give you another in your audience another insight into that culture is I go to call missing child, and I'm not. This is just for example. Go to missing call child. We're looking around, find the child, bring them to the mom's home. Great, the child's home, everything's taken care of. 5 minutes later, there's an assault in progress around the corner. So now I go to this call, and now I'm dealing and I'm fighting and I'm rolling around on the ground with this guy. And now here comes my partner. He helps me take this person into custody. And this guy would have got the better of me if my partner didn't come help me. So we deal with that. Okay, great. That guy's arrested. That guy's in custody. That guy's going to jail. Okay, next call for service. Okay, somebody says the neighbor's dog is too loud. They're playing their music. I gotta go knock on the door of the house. Okay, I'm gonna go knock on the door of the house after I just was rolling around the ground. Excuse me, sir, there's a noise ordinance. We need you to turn your music down. Hey, expletive, you cops, you guys, da 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 da. I'll play my music as loud, sir. We're gonna have right. So you massage this situation, right?
Yeah.
Code 3 response. There's a shooting in progress. One of your officers is shot. I am really glossing over, but there are officers they go from call to call to call like that. And now this person that saved you in that assault, now that person that backed you when you were in that active shooter event or not, possibly
Mhm.
shooting in these dangerous situations, now you're watching them kneel on a person, or now
Mm.
you're kneeling on a person. And so suddenly there's this deeper relationship you have, there's this closer bond. I mean, officer patrol partners, some people, some people get closer to their patrol partners than their own family members because
Mhm.
you're in life and death situations. It's not that different than when you go into a war zone or you get deployed in the army. You become family with these people that you're in these trenches with. So for
Mhm.
you to have to step out in that moment, again, if you think back to Derek Chauvin, a crowd around them, and it's like, I have to tell my brother that he's doing something wrong in front of these
Mhm.
people, and they're yelling at things, and now I'm going to be seen as being on the public side. So those are those dynamics and fears.
Yeah.
Finding
I
man is how we keep all that in line.
yeah, and I can't even imagine what that world would be like. Or, the people that like say, yeah, I'm signing up for this because that just seems like destabilizing all day. You're just whiplashing, like trying to true yourself up to the moment. Then the moment changes. Then it's another moment. And I guess, because of the way that I am built, because of the nature of my work, um, and just who I am, I really, really, truthfully, I just struggle with this idea of just not being able to place humanity first, right? Or
Mhm.
stop something that's happening because I don't know how that would look or how I could respond. That said, there are things that I do, um, and I say, and people do not understand it. And that's in what I do. I'm not even on the front line, but people have chosen who I am and what I stand for.
Mhm.
And they've already decided it. And
Mhm.
so they hear what I say through that filter of she is going around race baiting or she is going around, and they operate and listen to me through that filter, right? And so I understand how those mechanisms work. Even agreements, like social societal agreements we have about law enforcement. It is so weird to me that when I say to people, like I don't even say it really. As a Black woman, I've had nothing but really personally good experiences with law enforcement. When I've needed law enforcement or when I've called, I have had really great experiences. And I don't people feel some kind of way that I am some way on the side of law enforcement, or that I raise up law enforcement in these ways because you know what they do. And I'm like, yeah, I know what we see that they do, but my personal experience is not that. Right. And so, but as a Black person, I'm like, girl, don't be going down the street, praising law enforcement. You trying to get your card snatched. You trying to, and plus people who have had don't know how to separate Sergeant Barros from, again, the uniform. So yeah, I understand all of it. And even though my mind struggles to understand how something that feels so all hands on deck, like right now, let's stop this, there's all these other variables. Right. I want to ask you a question about just an experience that you've had that really has profoundly impacted your views on community policing and the importance of building trust with the public. Do you have, there's actually a story that I've heard you share that I'm trying to lean you to sharing that story, but that one or any one other?
Yeah, that one is, it's interesting hearing your feedback and about your perspective too. And I will say, don't feel as though you're not in it too. You're certainly in the arena, right? I was looking up kind of things to try to get my mind prepared for today's conversation. And I came across Theodore Roosevelt's speech about the man in the arena, and about how it's the person that's striving in the arena, whether they win or fail, that is always going to be looked at as being a greater contributor than the person that's just on the sideline complaining. Mm-hmm. It also, while you were talking today, it brings up my thought that if I'm wearing this uniform, that's less one bad cop that can put it on. Mm-hmm. So if I'm not in this uniform, who knows who could be in this spot in the future? Mm-hmm. Sure, they might be some hotshot cop that's got all this stuff, but they treat cultures, they bring their racism and discrimination to their job, and they insult the badge personally, I think, when they wear that uniform. But that was difficult, and it kind of does go back to George Floyd. One of these community building, there's actually two community building moments. One where it was shortly after George Floyd, and I was on foot patrol in the area where I police, and there's a lot of cars and people are getting in and out of cars, and I'm just walking down the street and I see a person getting out of their car, and their young son gets out of the car too. It's a Black father and his son, and literally the tensions are hot, like the riots and the protests, whichever they have descended into at that moment, were still going on. It was fresh on people's minds. And I saw this father lean down to his son and start to talk to him, but while he's making eye contact with you. So you kind of know that he's talking to his son about you. Mm-hmm. So immediately my brain, to my discredit or bias, it went into that mode of, am I going to have to avoid him yelling and screaming because he's told his son, look, there's a cop, there's this. There are, forgive me if your podcast listeners aren't using these sorts of phrases, but it has happened before, being called an Uncle Tom. Mm-hmm. Phrase where, you're the Black guy that would help catch runaway slaves. Essentially is where that kind of dynamic paradigm is. So that's what I was expecting. Lo and behold, as I got closer and I listened to what this man was telling his son, he pointed to me and he said, son, look, you can be a police officer too. Mm-hmm. That is what I carry with me when it gets tough, is that I know that people will see you walking in your uniform wherever you are. And I'm taking a moment to speak to any law enforcement officer that might come across your podcast. You're in your uniform and you think people are thinking the worst of you. But most people look at you and are saying, okay, there's some person here that if it goes sideways, we know at least you're the one that's supposed to respond to this problem. That automatically gives people a sense of comfort and security. Your presence alone, when you wear the uniform, gives people this sense of okay, that's the person who's supposed to deal with these problems and issues. There are other people, obviously, that will look at it and, say, oh, you're this terrible person for wearing this uniform or this, that. But let's consider the alternative. let's snap our fingers and imagine an America where there are no police officers.
Mm.
I don't want to live in that country because that country is no longer safe, and that country means that people will take advantage of other people. So there's that dynamic when you mention it, as far as community policing and keeping what's in mind and what other officers have to go through. But that really sticks with me when it gets hard, is I remember that there's people that are watching the work I'm doing that I'm not even aware of.
Mm-hmm.
I walk around my job a lot, and a lot of times people are fighting to buy me coffee. They're like, "Let me buy you a cup of coffee." I'm like, "No, I can't. Just I'm good." But so you get that, but then you do get the people that are there to antagonize you and put their phones in your faces and doing these sorts of things. So that becomes a challenge. But the other case I had is I had an opportunity to speak at a recruitment event for minorities in law enforcement. And one of the things I reminded the people, these were people that just started their pursuit to become a police officer. They hadn't even applied yet. And one thing I told them is that don't be surprised if the people that are telling you, what, you want to be a police officer? You want to be a cop? Are you crazy? You shouldn't do that. Once you get in it and once you put the badge on and once you have it and you're wearing a uniform, they'll be the same people that are saying, I knew you should have been a cop. You look so good out there doing your job. I believed in you all the time. That's what'll happen. And it will happen. But I encourage people to remember, and anybody that's looking to get into to it, there's always going to be like a pendulum swinging in one direction or another with the general public and whether they accept police or don't accept police. I implore people to look beyond just their own lens. And I'll say this and then kind of wrap up these comments. But you have to, when I was going through some of my educational programs, some of my college professors reminded me, they would say, look for evidence that you're wrong. In other words, if you have a bias or you have a thought, or you have something, you've got to be open to saying to yourself, I may be wrong about this. My thought that I have about this is wrong. And go seek that data, go seek that information that helps you prove whether you're right or wrong. You might come across all the data in the world that proves that, oh yeah, my guess was right. But then you might also come across all the information in the world that proves you that you're wrong. Be open to whatever that exploration of knowledge will take you to, which I implore people never to try to lock into one media source. Use a variety of media sources. They got the All Things Grace All Things Grace podcast, which is the world's greatest podcast as far as I'm concerned. but you got podcasts, you got audiobooks, you got YouTube videos, you've got media outlets, you've got documentaries, you've got all kinds of stuff. You got just talk to an officer. Just go up to an officer every now and then and start a conversation. You'll learn so much about what they're going through that will hopefully help put people's minds at ease, and that take those opportunities and chances when safe to do so. Mm-hmm. So that's ultimately kind of the two that come to mind when I think about your question and trying to find a way to pull myself, in the job, doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what is it that you just wish people understood or knew about policing, about the role, just about the realities of your job? What is the one thing you wish people knew that you believe would really change how they think about or talk about or relate to law enforcement?
The one thing I think, or the one thing I would hope people understand is that we're listening. If you don't engage, go to your town hall, participate in your government. My wife hates to vote. Every time she sees her ballot comes in, I'm like, no, it's your civic duty. Get your ballot. It's painful and it's difficult to, sometimes it seems tedious to deal with it. But we are listening. I think that's one thing. Don't think that when you have a complaint, I've dealt with several complaints over the last however many years it's been now, several that I've been a sergeant, and I've had to call people, and I always try to end that call with the sense of that the person's been heard, mm-hmm. that there will be some action or some at least other conversations that go on about to address whatever concern that they have. And if necessary, it'll be sent up to the necessary disciplinary chains that it needs to go through. So I don't ever want people to think that, because that's part of our job as supervisors, the leaders in law enforcement. It's our job to give and enable our officers to do their job well. And we can't do that if we're not continuing to refine and continuing to sharpen our toolbox. And that is a painful, unfortunate, slow process sometimes. You're a doctor, obviously, Dr. Major, so you know all about deep research and critical thinking, how long it can take for you to write a paper. And just now imagine trying to do that, on a national or even state scale with law enforcement. So the task and the challenge is great, but we need the public, I think, to continue to engage us. I would say too, don't shy away from understanding that the cases that you may see of excessive force or officer involved shooting and things like that, try to take those one scenario at a time and do that work of slowing down. I learned it in law enforcement. I like to think I was doing it all the time, but especially in law enforcement now, it's collect all the facts. I think if our public and if the people in the public can say, this does not look good, but yeah, we have to let these people bring us the facts. It's part of the reason why it takes so long to get a case to go to trial with a jury, right? Because they're doing their investigation so that when the jury meets and decides whether this person is innocent or guilty, they have all the factual circumstances with it, or at least they try to do the best job that we can with that. And I remind people that our democracy and our government, our country, it's a living thing, right? It's going to continue to evolve and learn and grow. You can think back, not even 60 years ago now, there was Jim Crow laws, 60, 70 years was Jim Crow. We evolved and grew out of that, and we continue to do so. And it doesn't feel like you make any progress, right? You feel like, oh, it's the same stuff. You want to throw your hands up and say, I quit. Imagine what Martin Luther King felt. Imagine what Malcolm X felt. Imagine what the leaders felt. Imagine what your ancestors, my ancestors felt. Like, is this ever going to stop the chains, the violence of chattel slavery? Is this going to come to an end? Imagine what they would look at now, seeing Dr. McDoctor, talking freely, and this is they would be blown away. I think we are the victory of those people in chains. It doesn't feel like it. And we all are, I think, too, even when I do, because I'm a EDI representative at my job, so I can relate to what you deal with. I try to really focus on the I, inclusion. Mm-hmm. And when people, especially my white colleagues, they sometimes will feel like, oh, you're just trying to tell me I'm racist. As soon as they hear EDI, they think you're trying to tell me I'm racist. I'm like, no, I want to know the good and the bad and the ugly of your culture as well as my culture. There's bad stuff in the Black community. There's good and bad stuff in the white community. There's good and bad stuff in the Latino community. Every community has it. Mm-hmm. But part of that inclusion is that we want there to be an understanding of that, because that's how we're going to make progress. I spoke at a public service conference a couple of years back, and when I gave my speech, I told them, I don't know what it's like to be a white man in America. I've only ever been a Black man, but I'm never going to know the challenges of what define a typical white man in America, right? Like, you got a lawyer, doctor, farmer, co-worker, all these different jobs that these people have. They're white men that are homeless, right? They're struggling. If I'm going to be a guardian of the public and democracy, I've got to be able to relate to all those different types of people. And I can't do that if I dismiss them, right? I can't do that if I say, oh, the white people need to go over there and sit in that corner and be quiet. I got to at least bring them in. But if they're going to come in, they got to know we're going to unpack some dark stuff. It's not going to bother anybody, but we're going to have to confront it, because we cannot go down the road with a busted wheel, which is what it feels like we do right now. So,
wow. So I managed to get through 3 of my questions. So
okay. I took too much of it.
I had like so many questions, but they kept coming, and I have so many more in my mind. Maybe we can go do a part 2, but I'm just saying, like, so many questions about, thank you, honey. Just basically how we, like, what do we do? What do we do from here? What are the best steps that both law enforcement and community members can take to bridge this divide? What do those conversations look like? What does it look like, in particular in the Black community? And maybe Black, and I'm not Indigenous, but I just see the invisibilization of Indigenous communities. So that in and of itself, how incredibly invisible the Indigenous culture is in our political systems, in our social systems, in our religious, right? And so, how do we have these conversations, and how do we tend to those needs, particularly of 2 groups that historically the very nature of the Black struggle and the indigenous struggle came
Mhm.
from one, either trying to take all your land, take everything from you, in which case we'll take your stuff and kill off as many of you as we can,
Mhm.
or the Black experience, which is now that we've got all this stolen stuff, we need somebody to take care of it and
Right.
build more on it. So come on, Black folks, now,
Right.
and there's just
Right.
different ways oppression looks,
Mhm.
when those are your two primary motivations. I can't think of any other groups where the primary motivation was so fundamental to our success as a nation.
Right.
The land that we build people, and the land that we take, and the people that we exploit to
Mhm.
make it profitable, right?
Right.
Two completely different structures. So I would love to dig into some of that, but for now, we'll stop. And I just want to thank you so much, for sharing your voice and allowing space for a conversation that we all feel and know. And there's this law enforcement and all the things that come with it. But my world is all about, the world that I want to create is all about creating spaces to have these dialogues
Okay.
like this. Now, I do ask every guest this question.
Mhm.
And so the question is, on a scale from 1 to 10.
Mhm.
1 is, I don't like this life. It's too hard. I just want another one. I'm ready. I can't with this life. 10 is, I can't imagine a more amazing life. Like,
Mhm.
wow, this is my life. I get to live this life. Not compartmentalizing, like work is this number and family is that, but all together, what would you give your life? And do you know what would make it a 10, if you believe in tens?
Well, it's interesting you asked that. I've got I guess, maybe a unique answer. I don't know. Maybe not a unique answer. I don't know. I don't believe in 10. And the reason why I don't believe in 10 is for a variety of reasons. I think 10 is heaven. 10
Mm,
is like the afterlife. 10 is you're at a table with whatever luminary being you believe in. Me, I believe in Christ. I mean, but other people believe in different things. So whatever that existence is for you, that's 10. You're with that person, and you're with your ancestors, and you're with your loved ones, and everyone is there. And I do believe in that. So it's definitely not a 10. um, the challenges you face, but having the family and the support and the friendship and the networks. Um, Too many people say 7. Some people probably just from statistics will say 7. Um, there is a lot of things I hope to achieve, but I think if I had to put it all together, I'd say an 8.
okay.
I am on that higher end, because when you really put things in perspective, when you look at the world and what's going on all across it, first of all, I live in a nation that has a ton of freedoms in it.
Mhm.
Um, the things that we deal with here in this country, could you imagine being in Gaza right now,
Mm,
regardless of where you stand on that issue? Would you want to be there right now? Right? Would you want to be in Ukraine right now? Would you want to be in any of these places that are hard? Would you want to be in those people? Ask them that question. What would they think? So I think people, and maybe that's just me being overly optimistic, but I try to be an optimistic person. Um, so yeah, I think it's an 8. I mean, my kids, wife, family, you know, the stuff that we deal with, they call it third world problems. I mean,
mhm.
we really are there. But I don't want, at the same time, I don't want to belittle my other challenges
Yeah,
or make them seem like those challenges don't consume a lot of my thought. They definitely do.
yeah.
Uh, but there are so many other things that would be a challenge that I couldn't imagine. And thinking even about, you mentioned indigenous people, I think about immigrants. Could you
Mm,
imagine packing your family up and having to cross a river to go to a country where you have no documents, where you barely speak the language there, and all because where you're coming from was so violent and so crazy that you couldn't get yourself out of it, right? And so for that reason, I would think that those things contribute to my answer, because I couldn't imagine being in that position. And yes, we are a nation of laws. We should enforce these laws, but laws were meant. If we think about the founding fathers, right? They're Many of them were slave owners. Almost all of them were slave owners, right? But
mhm.
one thing they did that I can definitely support is they gave us the ability to change our government and change our laws. So we have the chance and the opportunity to change how we treat immigrants, to change how we treat each other, to change how we treat our systems. And if we have that opportunity, that already puts us north of 5, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we have the ability in this country. So I think if we can do more of that and do those things and really bog in, that gives me that sense. I can't tell you how many things I wish were different. I mean, I could sit there, but it's a blessing. So it's great to spend the time with you.
Thank you so much. I can't think of a better way to end this conversation, but thank you so much.
Yeah,
I guess you're ready in this conversation too. Yeah. But thank you so much, and I would love to have you back.
Okay, anytime, Dr. Majors. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed what you heard today. If you did, please click the small bell and become a subscriber and join me in spreading the message of grace.